The Mellotron. You may not be familiar with the name, but you've most certainly heard one. At least, if you've listened to any significant amount of music from the 1960s or 70s. From about 1967 through the mid-1970s, it was everywhere. And while now associated with the progressive rock movement of the era, it also appeared on many a top 40 pop song, and can even be heard on classic rock staples like Dream On and Freebird. Yes, even Freebird.
'Cause I'm as free as a bird now, and this bird you ever change.
But what was this unique and ubiquitous instrument? How did it become so popular? And why didn't its popularity last?
It was an early form of musical sampler. Everyone knows the word sampler now. But it was held together by bicycle chains, and the Beatles used it.
Okay, cool. But how did one of these strange things actually work in an era before digital recording existed? Perhaps there's no one more qualified to explain than a man who worked in the factory where they were built. Moody Blues keyboardist Mike Pinder.
It's a tape recorder that outgrew its tape recorder. So it basically boils down to that each key represents a tape recorder. But instead of it having two reels and it just goes to the end and it stops, it's actually looped. Two loops going down that have rollers on them and springs. So as I press the note, the tape plays and goes into the bin, and the springs with the rollers on them move up, and as soon as I let go of it, they drop down again to the beginning of the tape.
While the Mellotron was not the first instrument made with a similar concept, it would become the definitive one through its proliferation in popular music after its creation in 1963. It's unclear when it was first adopted for use by rock musicians, but perhaps the first single to feature one was Baby Can It Be True by the Graham Bond Organization in 1965. Though Manfred Mann's semi-detached Suburban Mr. James, a single released in late 1966, is also recognized as one of the earliest examples of a mellotron being used for a pop or rock recording. 1967, however, would turn out to be the most pivotal year for the mellotron. First, the Beatles used one prominently on their song Strawberry Fields Forever, released as a single that February. Following this, the Moody Blues released the album Days of Future Past in November, which featured the mellotron heavily throughout, but perhaps most prominently on the album's lead single, Nights in White Satin. The combination of these two releases, both using the instrument so prominently, helped to considerably raise the popularity of it, and by the end of the decade, it became widely used by musicians in the burgeoning new field of progressive rock. The appeal of the instrument to the world of rock music was obvious. Appearing just as artists like the Beatles and the Beach Boys were helping bring the genre to new highs by experimenting with unconventional instrumentation and more lush orchestration, the Mellotron could allow any band with a keyboard player to access similar sounds without the need for access to an actual orchestra. This was great for up-and-coming bands like Yes, Genesis, and King Crimson, all of whom sought to expand the horizons of rock music. Furthermore, it allowed much more ability to create orchestral sounds and textures in live shows that had not really existed before. After all, if you couldn't afford to record with an orchestra, you probably wouldn't be able to afford bringing one on tour with you. In effect, it broadened the horizons when it came to being able to reproduce what was on the records in concert. Later iterations of the instrument even implemented design changes to make it easier for musicians to take on tour.
It's a sort of strange, ethereal sound that had never been really heard before. People weren't used to hearing kind of orchestral sounds coming out of a big stack of amplifiers like that.
But such success and ubiquity could not last. By the early 1980s, the Mellotron was decidedly out of fashion. Synthesizer technology had advanced so much over the course of the 1970s, and the old Mellotron was now virtually obsolete in the face of new synthesizers, the likes of which could create much more realistic orchestral sounds. Developments like these came as though answering the prayers of musicians who had been touring with Mellotrons, which despite being capable of going on the road in theory, was very often a nightmare to tour with in practice.
The whole system just went wrong all the time. And we had to use it, we got to the stage we were rebuilding it every night because it was structurally so unsound, and it was real chaos.
And so, despite its prominence, the Mellotron seemed to have gone the way of the dodo, left as an interesting little bit of obsolete musical technology, but mostly forgotten about by the general public, like listening to music on wax cylinders or 8-track. But like vinyl records, the Mellotron never completely went away, and would eventually come to occupy a similar niche amongst musical hipsters, with the old machine, and new digital versions of it, still appearing on recordings to the present day.
The first sound that kind of opens up the song is this little Mellotron. So you have that and a kick.
But why? Why bother with such an outdated and difficult machine in the year of our Lord 2022? Why go to all the trouble to use an antiquated device that doesn't even sound that much like a real orchestra? Well, that's exactly why. It doesn't sound like a real orchestra. Mellotron sounds like, well, it sounds like a tape of an orchestra being played back. When you listen to a recording featuring one, you're effectively listening to a recording of a recording, a copy of a copy, with all of the uncanniness that comes with that. The Mellotron, despite having been created to imitate and mimic the sounds of other instruments, had in turn created its own unique and unmistakable sound. And when such an unmistakable sound is created, people will want to imitate it, and it's not hard to see why. Many of the pieces originally recorded with Mellotron just don't have the same energy when played with a better synthesizer or even a real orchestra. So, in a way, failing to properly imitate what it was supposed to made it, in itself, impossible to imitate. This was a facet of the instrument that was not unnoticed in its early days either. Some of those early, pivotal records I mentioned, in fact, feature real orchestras along with the Mellotron. The Beatles could certainly have arranged for actual flutes to be played on Strawberry Fields, and the entirety of Days of Future Past was recorded with the London Festival Orchestra. Because despite all the talk of the Mellotron being used to make bands sound like orchestras, it ultimately came to occupy its own unique place in the musical landscape. Otherwise, why would the Moody Blues have used one at all, other than just to give Mike Pinder something to do? Put simply, it's because those very issues that made the Mellotron imperfect, made it a living hell to tour with, and eventually led to its obsolescence, gave it one of the most unique characters of any instrument in the world, and one that can instantly evoke a musical era when used.